The document sits in the German Federal Archives, folder R6/34, item 21, 13 pages of typed orders bearing Adolf Hitler's signature. December 18, 1940. The heading reads, Directive Number 21, Case Barbarossa. The paper is yellowed now. The ink has faded. But the words remain as sharp as the day they condemned 3 million German soldiers to death. Hitler wrote it himself. Not the generals. Not the staff officers. Him. Sitting in his study at the Berghof, looking out at the Bavarian Alps, drafting the largest military operation in human history, like a grocery list. The directive opens with standard military language. Deployment schedules, army group assignments, supply calculations. Then comes paragraph 3. The line that changed everything. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. Read it again. Quick campaign. Before the war against England ends. Hitler assumed victory in Russia would take 10 weeks. 10. The Wehrmacht's own planning documents allocated fuel and ammunition for a campaign lasting until October 1st, 1941. After that, the panzers would roll into Moscow for the victory parade. The Luftwaffe would redeploy west to finish Britain. Case closed. But buried in that same directive, hidden among the operational details, lies the reason Barbarossa was doomed from the moment Hitler signed it. Not because the Wehrmacht was weak. They weren't. Not because the plan was flawed. It wasn't. But because of 3 words that no one in Berlin wanted to acknowledge. The vastness. The Soviet Union covered 22.4 million square kilometers. From the Polish border to the Pacific Ocean stretched 11 time zones. The distance from Brest-Litovsk to Moscow alone was over 1,000 kilometers. Further than from Berlin to Rome. And Moscow wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Franz Halder understood numbers. As chief of the General Staff, he'd calculated everything. The Wehrmacht would advance with 3.2 million men across a front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. 2,000 kilometers wide, the largest military force ever assembled, surely enough to crush any resistance. On July 3, 1941, 2 weeks into the invasion, Halder wrote in his diary, I do not doubt that east of the Dvina and Dnieper, we will encounter nothing more than partial forces. The Red Army was collapsing. Entire divisions surrendered. The panzers advanced 50 kilometers per day. Moscow lay open. Victory seemed inevitable. Here's what Halder didn't calculate. The Red Army's capacity to absorb punishment that would have destroyed any Western military. By August 2nd, Army Group Center had suffered 74,500 casualties. Replacements? 23,000. The mathematics were brutal. For every 3 Germans killed or wounded, the Wehrmacht could replace 1. But the Soviets? Different equation entirely. Halder's confidence cracked first in his diary entries. August 11th, if we smash a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. The Red Army kept coming. Fresh divisions appeared from nowhere. Siberian troops who'd never seen a German uniform. Factory workers handed rifles and told to hold the line. They died in thousands, tens of thousands. And still they came. The Wehrmacht's intelligence had estimated the Red Army possessed 170 divisions. By December, they'd identified 360. The numbers didn't add up. They couldn't add up. But there they were, in the snow outside Moscow, shooting back with Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH submachine guns. Temperature became the enemy no general could outflank. Field Marshal von Bock recorded minus 29 degrees Celsius on November 5th. The Wehrmacht's vehicles wouldn't start. Oil froze solid. Weapons jammed. Half the attacking battalions suffered frostbite casualties exceeding combat losses. German soldiers wore summer uniforms because the quick campaign would be over before winter. The Red Army wore valenki, felt boots designed for Russian winters, sheepskin coats that kept a man warm at minus 30 degrees. They'd been preparing for this war in this climate for decades. The Germans were tourists freezing to death in someone else's country. Logistics strangled the Wehrmacht slowly. The railway gauge in Russia was different, wider. German trains couldn't run on Soviet tracks. Everything had to be transferred by hand at the border. Partisan attacks destroyed supply convoys. The Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, turned roads into rivers of filth that swallowed entire supply columns. By November 27th, Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner reported German forces at the end of their resources in both personnel and materiel. The 3.2 million man army was consuming more ammunition, fuel, and food than German industry could produce and the damaged rail network could deliver. Mathematics again. Brutal and simple. But here's the thing that haunts every study of Barbarossa, every after-action report, every historical analysis. Hitler knew this would happen. Not the details, not the specific casualty figures or temperature readings. But he knew Russia was vast. He knew Russian winters were cold. He knew the Red Army was enormous. He wrote the directive anyway. No contingency planning for winter warfare. No provisions for extended operations. No consideration of what happened if the quick campaign wasn't quick. The entire operation hinged on Soviet collapse within 10 weeks. If that didn't happen, if the Red Army fought back, if winter arrived before victory, the Wehrmacht would find itself stranded 2,000 kilometers from home with no way to sustain the offensive. Soviet commanders understood something their German counterparts missed. Space could be traded for time. Cities could be abandoned, armies could retreat. But the vastness remained. Every kilometer the Wehrmacht advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Every day the campaign lasted brought winter closer. Every Soviet division that refused to surrender made the quick campaign a little less quick. The Red Army didn't need to win battles. They needed to survive them, to keep existing. To keep the Wehrmacht moving deeper into the vastness where German efficiency meant nothing and Russian endurance meant everything. Stalin had his own directive. Order number 227, not one step back. But the real Soviet strategy was simpler, deeper. Make the Germans come to you. Make them cross the vastness. Make them fight in the snow. Make them discover that conquering Russia required more than superior tactics and better equipment. It required surviving Russia itself. Hitler's signature on Directive 21 authorized the largest military operation in history. But hidden in those 13 pages of operational details lay the seeds of Germany's destruction. Not because the Wehrmacht couldn't fight. They could. Not because the plan couldn't work. It almost did. But because Adolf Hitler, sitting in his mountain retreat, looking out at the Alps, somehow convinced himself that willpower could overcome geography. That 10 weeks was enough time to conquer a country that had never been conquered. That the German soldier was Superman enough to defeat not just the Red Army, but winter itself. The directive that was supposed to end the war in the East instead guaranteed it would consume everything, every reserve, every replacement, every last German boy who could hold a rifle. The vastness won. It always wins. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. Hitler wrote those words himself. December 18, 1940. Black ink on cream paper. Furtator his, signature at the bottom, sharp and confident. The directive that would doom 3.2 million German soldiers began with a tactical assumption so basic it barely merited discussion among the general staff. Destroy the Red Army at the frontier? Shatter Soviet resistance before it could retreat into the vastness. The logic was flawless. Blitzkrieg demanded speed over depth, armored spearheads punching through defensive lines, encircling entire armies before they could reorganize. It had worked in Poland, 35 days. It had worked in France, 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions moved like steel arrows, fast and sharp and unstoppable. But arrows only work if the target stands still. Soviet doctrine said otherwise: defense in depth. Trade space for time. Let the enemy advance into killing ground, then strangle his supply lines. The Red Army had been practicing this for 20 years. They had the geography for it. 22.4 million square kilometers. 11 time zones, distances that could swallow armies whole. But here's what no one asked in that fluorescent briefing room at the Berghof. What happens if they don't collapse? The German plan required Soviet forces to be destroyed west of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers, clean encirclements, mass surrenders, prisoner counts in the hundreds of thousands. Franz Halder, Chief of General Staff, was explicit about this. Beyond those rivers, he expected to encounter nothing more than partial forces. Scattered remnants fleeing east into the steppe. The mathematics were unforgiving. Army Group Center would advance at 50 kilometers per day across a front 2,000 kilometers wide. Panzer Group 2 would swing north of the Pripyat marshes. Panzer Group 3 would drive straight for Smolensk. Behind them, infantry divisions would mop up bypassed pockets and secure the flanks. Classic blitzkrieg. Mobility over mass. Speed over strength. Except the Red Army kept coming. The first sign came, early, August 2nd, 1941. Army Group Center had suffered 74,500 casualties. Replacements totaled 23,000. Simple subtraction. The Wehrmacht was bleeding faster than Berlin could bandage the wounds. Panzer divisions that had crossed the frontier at full strength now operated at 45% capacity. The steel arrows were blunting against Russian steel. Halder's tone shifted in his diary entries. July 3rd, supreme confidence. If we smash a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. August 11th, growing concern. The enemy had practically unlimited reserves. Where German intelligence estimated 170 Soviet divisions, they now faced 360. The Red Army wasn't collapsing, it was multiplying. The Wehrmacht's own reports told the story in clinical detail. 10-day periodic assessments tracked losses in men, horses, motor vehicles, weapons, equipment, munitions, and fuels. The numbers painted a picture of systematic degradation. Consumption rates exceeded production capacity. Supply convoys stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. Rail gauge differences between German and Soviet systems meant every ton of supplies had to be transferred by hand at the frontier. Then winter arrived with Siberian fury. November 5th, 1941. Field Marshal von Bock recorded temperatures of -29 degrees Celsius. German soldiers wore summer uniforms and leather boots. They had no winter coats, no insulated gloves, no felt boots like the Red Army's Valenki. Frostbite casualties rivaled combat losses. Half of attacking battalions reported men unable to operate weapons due to frozen fingers. The Wehrmacht had planned for a summer war. 10 weeks, Hitler had said. Victory before the first snow. But the first snow fell in October, and the Red Army was still fighting. Soviet troops wore sheepskin coats and felt boots. They knew how to start engines in sub-zero temperatures. They understood that metal becomes brittle at -30 degrees. They had been preparing for winter war since childhood. German logistics collapsed with mechanical precision. Horse-drawn transport, critical when motor vehicles failed in extreme cold, suffered massive losses. Horses died from exposure faster than they could be replaced. Supply convoys sat immobilized by snow and fuel shortages. The Rasputitsa, Russia's mud season, had already weakened German mobility before winter delivered the killing blow. Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner summarized the situation with bureaucratic understatement. November 27, 1941. German forces were at the end of their resources in both personnel and materiel. The Wehrmacht, designed for rapid, decisive victory, had run out of everything that mattered: men, machines, momentum. But the tactical failure ran deeper than logistics. Blitzkrieg required enemy collapse at the point of contact. German armored spearheads needed Soviet forces to break and run, creating gaps for exploitation. Instead, they found an army that bent without breaking. Soviet units that were surrounded kept fighting. Bypassed positions became strong points. The Red Army's ability to regenerate forces exceeded every German projection. The Wehrmacht had trained to fight the last war's enemy: static defenses, linear positions, armies that would surrender when their front lines cracked. But the Red Army wasn't the French army. Soviet commanders understood that retreat wasn't defeat. They had space to trade for time. They had reserves behind the reserves. They had a population that viewed German invasion not as conquest, but as extermination. German intelligence had failed at the most basic level. They counted Soviet divisions but missed Soviet determination. They mapped Red Army positions but ignored Red Army psychology. Russian soldiers weren't fighting for Stalin or communism. They were fighting for survival. German racial ideology guaranteed that surrender meant slavery or death. The Red Army fought like cornered animals because they were cornered animals. The Directive's fatal flaw lay in its casual confidence. Crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, as if the Soviet Union were Poland scaled up, as if 20 years of Soviet military doctrine meant nothing, as if geography and climate and human endurance could be overcome by tactical superiority alone. Hitler knew the risks. He had written them down himself: the vastness of the country, the harshness of the climate, the resilience of the population. But he had no contingency for failure, no plan for winter warfare, no strategy for extended operations across thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain. The Directive assumed success because it had to. Failure was unthinkable because it was also unsurvivable. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign. Those 21 words condemned 3 million German soldiers to fight a war their doctrine couldn't win, their logistics couldn't sustain, and their leadership couldn't end. The quick campaign became 4 years of attrition. The crushed enemy became the crusher. The prepared Wehrmacht became the unprepared victim of its own assumptions. The Directive that promised victory delivered catastrophe instead. The document was 7 pages long. Hitler wrote it himself, not dictated to a secretary, not drafted by staff officers. His handwriting, his signature, his absolute certainty that the Soviet Union would collapse in 14 weeks. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. Read that again. Before the conclusion of the war against England, Hitler was so confident he could destroy the Soviet Union that he planned to do it while still fighting Britain. The arrogance is breathtaking. The miscalculation would prove fatal. But in June 1941, that miscalculation looked like genius. The panzers crossed the frontier at 03:15 hours on the 22nd of June. 3 army groups, 150 divisions, the largest military operation in human history. And for the first 3 weeks, everything went exactly as planned. Army Group North advanced 400 kilometers in 18 days. Army Group South encircled 600,000 Soviet troops near Kiev. Army Group Center punched through the Stalin Line like it was made of paper. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first 48 hours. Most never got off the ground. The German generals were euphoric. This was Poland again. This was France again. The enemy would break. They always broke. But here's what no one asked. What happens when they don't? The first sign came at Brest-Litovsk, a fortress on the border that German planners expected to fall in hours. It held for a week. Soviet soldiers fought from the rubble with Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH submachine guns until the ammunition ran out. Then they fought with bayonets, then with rocks. The Germans took the fortress, but the delay was unexpected. The second sign came from intelligence reports. Soviet divisions destroyed in the morning were back in the line by evening. New units appeared where none had existed before. The Red Army had an estimated 170 divisions when the war began. By August, German intelligence had identified 360. The Red Army kept coming. Franz Halder wrote in his diary on July 3rd, "The campaign has been won in 14 days. He was chief of the general staff, the most senior military planner in Germany. He believed the war was over before it had really begun." 3 weeks later, his tone changed completely. "If we smash a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen. The mathematics were becoming ugly. German casualties mounted faster than replacements arrived. Panzer divisions operated at 45% strength by late August. The advance slowed from 50 kilometers per day to 20, then 10, then stopped entirely. The vastness began to tell. 22.4 million square kilometers, 11 time zones, distances that swallowed entire army groups. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking. The railroads used a different gauge. Soviet workers had evacuated the rolling stock. German logistics officers calculated they needed 750 trains per day to sustain the offensive. They were getting 200. Winter came early. Snow fell in October. Temperatures dropped to -29 degrees Celsius by November. German soldiers wore summer uniforms, no winter coats, no felt boots, no gloves designed for sub-zero combat. The Soviet soldiers wore valenki, felt boots that kept feet warm in temperatures that froze German equipment solid. They had sheepskin coats. They had weapons designed to function in Arctic conditions. They were fighting on home ground in a climate they understood. But the real shock was industrial. German intelligence had located Soviet factories, marked them on maps, targeted them for bombing. What they missed was the evacuation. Entire industrial complexes dismantled and shipped east of the Urals, assembly lines rebuilt in caves. Production restarted within weeks. The Soviets moved 1,500 factories, 2 million railway cars of machinery, 10 million workers, the largest industrial evacuation in history. German planners had no contingency for an enemy who could move his entire economy beyond reach. So what actually happened? The Wehrmacht, designed for swift victory, met an enemy designed for total war. German tactical excellence met Soviet strategic depth. Professional soldiers met a population fighting for survival on their own soil. By December, Eduard Wagner reported German forces at the end of their resources in both personnel and material. The same army that had conquered France in 6 weeks was freezing to death outside Moscow. Supply convoys sat immobilized by snow. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Non-combat casualties from frostbite exceeded battle losses. The enemy Hitler expected to collapse in 14 weeks launched a winter counteroffensive that pushed the Wehrmacht back 200 kilometers. Soviet reserves that weren't supposed to exist materialized from Siberia. Fresh divisions equipped for winter warfare. T-34 tanks that functioned in temperatures that disabled German panzers. The document that started it all, Hitler's handwritten directive, had contained no mention of winter equipment, no discussion of extended supply lines, no contingency for Soviet resistance lasting beyond autumn. The planning assumed success because success had always come before. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign. Quick. The entire strategy rested on that single word. Quick victory before the Soviet Union could mobilize its vast resources. Quick conquest before winter set in. Quick collapse before the industrial evacuation could succeed. But the Red Army didn't collapse on schedule. The factories didn't stay put. Winter didn't wait for German victory, and the quick campaign became a 4-year nightmare that would consume the Wehrmacht and ultimately destroy the Reich. The document was 7 pages long. Hitler wrote it himself, and in those 7 pages lay the seeds of Germany's destruction. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. Hitler wrote those words himself on December 18, 1940. 7 pages of meticulous planning. He signed it personally. Directive number 21. Case Barbarossa. By November, the mathematics had turned lethal. Army Group Center's strength reports told the story in brutal precision. 74,500 casualties by August 2nd. 23,000 replacements received. The gap widened daily. Panzer divisions operated at 45% capacity. Half strength, half the tanks, half the crews, half the punch that had shattered France in 6 weeks. But here's what no one asked in those Berlin briefing rooms. What happens when quick becomes slow? When campaign becomes quagmire? The answer lay scattered across 2,000 kilometers of frozen steppe. German supply doctrine assumed rail transport. The Reich's quartermasters calculated precisely 750 trains daily to sustain 3.2 million men. They received 200. The difference between survival and starvation measured in missing rail cars. Soviet rail gauge ran wider than German standard. Every captured kilometer required conversion. Spike by spike, rail by rail, while winter closed in. Temperatures dropped to minus 29 degrees Celsius on November 5th. Field. Marshal von Bock recorded it in his diary. Clinical precision. Like documenting his army's death by degrees, the Red Army kept coming. Franz Halder had estimated 170 Soviet divisions at war's start. By August, German intelligence identified 360. The Soviets manufactured divisions faster than Wehrmacht could destroy them. Stalin's reserves multiplied. Hitler's dwindled. German soldiers wore summer uniforms in December snow, cotton tunics, leather boots, standard issue for the quick campaign that never ended. Soviet troops marched in Valenki felt boots, sheepskin coats, equipment designed for the vastness they defended. The L98K Mauser bolt froze solid at minus 30 degrees. Mechanism seized. Firing pin brittle. German tankers lit fires under their panzer engines each morning. If they had fuel. If the fuel hadn't crystallized. If the batteries held charge in cold that cracked steel. Supply convoys stretched across endless kilometers. Horse-drawn sleds when trucks failed. But horses died faster than machines. Starvation. Exposure. Artillery. The Wehrmacht lost hundreds of thousands of draft animals. Each death reduced mobility, reduced range, reduced the distance between ammunition and the men who needed it. Soviet partisans cut the threads that held German logistics together. Rail lines blown, bridges destroyed, convoys ambushed in forests that stretched beyond horizons. Every severed connection weakened the Wehrmacht's grip on conquered territory. No contingency existed for this scenario. German planning assumed Soviet collapse within 14 weeks. Operational studies detailed occupation procedures, administrative structures, resource exploitation. But nowhere in those meticulous files lay instructions for fighting a regenerating enemy through Russian winter with summer equipment and failing supply lines. Wehrmacht periodic reports documented the collapse in 10-day intervals: personnel strength, vehicle readiness, ammunition stocks, medical casualties. The numbers told their story. Non-combat losses from frostbite equaled battle casualties. Entire battalions rendered ineffective by cold, feet frozen in inadequate boots, fingers too numb to pull triggers. German doctrine emphasized speed, rapid advance, quick decision. Blitzkrieg assumed short campaigns against collapsing enemies. But the Red Army refused the script. Soviet resistance hardened. Defensive positions multiplied. The quick campaign became attritional warfare. Germany's greatest weakness. Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner's November 27th assessment read like an obituary. German forces at the end of their resources in both personnel and material. The Wehrmacht had reached culmination point. Maximum extension. No reserves, no replacements, no margin for error. But still the offensive continued. Military logic demanded withdrawal, consolidation, winter quarters, shortened supply lines, defensive positions. Every tactical principle screamed retreat. Yet German forces pressed toward Moscow through December snow. Orders from Berlin overruled reality on the ground. The forbidden tactic emerged from desperation, disguised as determination. Continue attacking when defense offered survival. Advance when retreat meant strategic sense. Commit reserves that didn't exist. Fight winter with summer plans. Soviet commanders understood. German desperation created opportunity. Red Army reserves concentrated. Fresh divisions from Siberian garrisons. Troops equipped for winter warfare. The correlation of forces shifted. Hunter became hunted. German soldiers in frozen trenches faced an enemy that owned the cold. Tu-34 tanks operated in temperatures that immobilized German armor. Soviet artillery functioned when German guns seized. Red Army infantry advanced through snow that trapped Wehrmacht units in place. The vastness consumed everything: distance, supplies, men, machines, hope. Russia's greatest weapon wasn't the Red Army. It was Russia itself. The endless kilometers that stretched German strength beyond breaking point. The winter that arrived on schedule while German planners pretended seasons could be ignored. By December, Wehrmacht strength reports resembled casualty lists. Divisions existed on paper. Companies fielded platoon strength. Battalions commanded by sergeants. The organizational structure that conquered Europe dissolved in Russian snow. Yet the orders never changed. Attack, advance, achieve the quick victory that arithmetic had already proven impossible. Hitler's directive promised Soviet collapse within weeks. Reality delivered German exhaustion within months. The gap between expectation and outcome, measured in frozen corpses, scattered across steppes that stretched beyond German comprehension. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign. Those words haunted every German commander who watched his men die for objectives that no longer mattered. The quick campaign had become a long nightmare, and winter had only begun. The words sat there on expensive paper, typed by a secretary who had no idea what she was recording. Hitler's personal directive, signed in his own hand, December 18, 1940. He wrote it himself. 7 pages of operational planning that contained the seeds of his own destruction. The Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign even before the conclusion of the war against England. Quick campaign. 2 words that would haunt 3 million German soldiers. But buried in paragraph 4, subsection C, was something else entirely. a warning so precise it reads like prophecy. Hitler acknowledged the vastness. 22.4 million square kilometers, 11 time zones. He knew the distances would stretch his forces beyond breaking point. He wrote about the danger of Soviet reserves regenerating faster than German forces could destroy them. He specifically warned against winter operations without proper equipment. He saw it all coming. Every disaster that would unfold over the next 4 years was anticipated in his own directive. So why did he sign it anyway? The answer reveals something darker than tactical miscalculation. This was willful blindness on a strategic scale. Hitler understood the risks clearly enough to document them in classified planning papers. But he built no contingency because admitting the possibility of failure meant admitting the war was unwinnable. Germany was already fighting Britain. Adding the Soviet Union created a two-front war that German logistics could not sustain. The mathematics were brutal, and Hitler knew it. Franz Halder understood it too. His private diary entries from July show a man watching his own predictions collapse in real time. "We estimated 170 Soviet divisions at the start," he wrote on August 11th. "We have now identified 360. The Red Army kept coming, division after division materializing from reserves that German intelligence never knew existed. By August, Wehrmacht periodic reports documented the hemorrhaging. Army Group Center operated at 45% strength. Supply trains that should have delivered 750 shipments daily managed 200. The Panzer spearheads that had torn through France in 6 weeks were grinding to a halt in the Russian steppes. Not from enemy action, from mathematics. Distance killed them first. The front stretched 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German doctrine required concentrated force at the point of attack. But concentration became impossible when your forces were scattered across a continent. Supply lines stretched like rubber bands. The further they advanced, the thinner they became. Then winter arrived exactly when Hitler's directive said it would. The temperature on November 5th dropped to minus 29 degrees Celsius. Field Marshal von Bock recorded it in his war diary with the precision of a man documenting a catastrophe. German soldiers wore cotton tunics and leather boots. The Red Army wore Valenki felt boots and sheepskin coats. Soviet equipment functioned at minus 30 degrees. German weapons froze solid. But here's the part that reveals the true scope of the miscalculation. This wasn't ignorance. Hitler's directive specifically mentioned winter equipment requirements. German quartermasters had detailed reports on Soviet winter gear dating back to the Finnish War. They knew what their soldiers would face. They chose not to prepare because preparing meant admitting the campaign might last longer than 10 weeks. Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner's assessment on November 27th reads like an epitaph. German forces are at the end of their resources in both personnel and materiel. The Wehrmacht had consumed its strategic reserves. Replacement rates fell, below 50% of casualties. Non-combat losses from frostbite equaled battle deaths. The Red Army did exactly what Hitler's directive warned they might do. They traded space for time. They regenerated faster than German forces could advance. They fought a winter war that German doctrine said was impossible to win. From a Soviet perspective, watching the Wehrmacht stumble through the winter of '41 was like watching a machine designed for precision warfare encounter problems it was never built to solve. Red Army officers had grown up in these temperatures. They understood that warfare below minus 20 degrees wasn't about courage or tactics. It was about basic survival. German soldiers couldn't feel their fingers well enough to operate bolt-action rifles. Soviet troops with proper winter training maintained combat effectiveness at minus 40 degrees. The T-34 tanks kept running when German panzers wouldn't start. Soviet logistics used horse-drawn sleds that functioned in any weather. German motorized transport required fuel that froze in the lines. The technological superiority that had dominated Western Europe became a liability in the Russian winter. Stalin himself later admitted the Soviet Union came within weeks of collapse during those first months, but winter bought them time. Time to relocate 1,500 factories beyond the Urals. Time to mobilize reserves from Siberian garrisons. Time for the Wehrmacht to discover that quick campaigns don't work against enemies with unlimited depth and the will to use it. Hitler's directive contained one final irony. The document that launched the largest military operation in human history concluded with detailed instructions for post-victory occupation duties, administrative procedures for governing conquered territories, economic policies for exploiting Soviet resources, 47 pages of planning for a future that would never exist. He wrote the blueprint for his own defeat and called it victory. The Wehrmacht that crossed the Soviet frontier in June carried enough supplies for 10 weeks of operations. They would fight for 4 years. The quick campaign became a war of attrition that Germany could not win and could not afford to lose. Every assumption in Hitler's directive proved catastrophically wrong except one. The vastness consumed everything. But the Soviets had made their own fatal assumptions. Stalin's purges had gutted the Red Army's officer corps. Soviet doctrine relied on mass mobilization that left millions of soldiers untrained and poorly equipped. The early German advances captured entire army groups. If Hitler had prepared for winter warfare, if German logistics had functioned across those distances, if the Wehrmacht had maintained its summer advance rates for just 6 more weeks, Moscow might have fallen. The Red Army's survival depended on German mistakes as much as Soviet resilience. Both sides gambled everything on assumptions that nearly destroyed them.